I never expected a simple weekend at my lake cabin to spiral into a full-blown nightmare. One moment, I was unpacking supplies, ready to finally relax, and the next, I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel. HOA Karen, marching up the driveway like she owned the place. But this wasn't just another petty complaint about a dock or a deck stain. No, she picked the absolute worst time to storm in. Right as I was about to meet the state attorney general about the very rules she was trying to enforce. How could one neighbor's obsession turn a peaceful retreat into a ticking legal disaster? 4 years, my lake cabin had been my sanctuary, the one place where the chaos of everyday life seemed to fade with the ripple of water against the dock. Mornings smelled of pine and fresh coffee, evenings were spent watching the sunset paint the lake in gold, and weekends meant laughter, fishing lines, and quiet reflection. My family and I loved this small lakeside community, not because it was perfect, but because it felt like a world slightly removed from the pressures of work, traffic, and deadlines. We knew the neighbors, waved at familiar faces on morning walks, and respected the small rules that kept our little slice of paradise orderly. But there was always the HOA lurking in the background, an unseen authority with a stack of bylaws thicker than the summer mosquitoes, a group of people ready to swoop in over the smallest infraction. Until that weekend, their presence was a quiet hum at the edge of our lives, something we barely noticed. It was a typical Friday when subtle signs hinted at trouble. A new email popped up in my inbox, friendly reminder, property compliance checks begin next week. Nothing alarming at first glance, just a nudge about keeping the dock tidy and landscaping neat. But there was an undercurrent, an unmistakable tone that felt like more than a reminder. It was a foreshadowing of someone who was watching, someone who could transform a peaceful weekend into a battlefield over trivial details. I had no idea that this routine check would escalate, dragging me into confrontations, threats of fines, and a web of absurd regulations that seemed designed to frustrate, humiliate, and control. And worse, the timing was about to collide with the one thing I couldn't afford to delay: a high-stakes meeting with the state attorney general about exactly the kind of overreach that the HOA represented. Little did I know, the weekend that began with coffee and calm would become a test of patience, principles, and legal nerve. The first sign of trouble was subtle, almost laughable if it weren't so infuriating. On Saturday morning, I noticed a bright orange notice pinned to my cabin door. Violation of HOA rules. Dock appearance non-compliant. Fine. $250. My brow furrowed. I had spent hours last week repainting the dock and clearing debris. Nothing about it seemed wrong. But the note, precise and formal, made it clear. Someone was watching, waiting for the perfect excuse to punish me. I crumpled it in my hand, a mix of disbelief and irritation simmering in my chest. By midday, Karen, everybody called her HOA Karen, appeared at the end of my driveway. She strode up like she owned the place, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning every inch of the property. She wasn't here for a friendly conversation or even to offer a warning. She was here to assert authority, and her timing couldn't have been worse. I had just unpacked supplies for the weekend, and my patience was already thin from the long drive. Karen's sharp eyes swept over my dock, my lawn, even the perfectly stacked firewood, and she began ticking boxes on her clipboard as if she were the judge of all things decent and lawful. "What seems to be the issue?" I asked, trying to stay calm. She didn't answer me directly. Instead, she pointed to a tiny patch of algae on the dock and murmured something about non-compliance with community aesthetic standards. The absurdity hit me like a punch. A green stain in a lake cabin environment? Surely that didn't warrant a $250 fine. But Karen's gaze didn't waver, and in that moment, I realized this wasn't about the dock. This was about control, about asserting dominance in a neighborhood where some people thrive on petty power plays. The weekend became a series of escalating annoyances. Each hour brought a new violation notice, each more ridiculous than the last. The HOA accused me of leaving trash bins slightly askew, planting flowers in non-designated areas, and even having a grill positioned improperly on the deck. Every violation carried a new fine, and every visit from Karen felt like a calculated escalation. She would appear without warning, inspecting, judging, and photographing evidence as though preparing for a courtroom showdown. Each encounter left me more frustrated and more determined not to bow to her whims. As tensions rose, I discovered that Karen wasn't acting alone. The HOA board, a small group of neighbors who had long nurtured a culture of control, began sending increasingly aggressive emails. They demanded immediate compliance with obscure rules, threatened legal action, and hinted that ignoring their demands could result in liens against my property. The language was clinical, but the tone carried menace. It felt personal, targeted. The HOA had transformed from a bureaucratic annoyance into a looming presence that could ruin weekends, finances, and sanity. I tried reasoning with them, of course. I documented every interaction, every notice, every absurd complaint. I emailed politely, attached photos showing compliance, and requested clarifications. Each response I received was either dismissive or passive-aggressive. There was no room for dialogue, only enforcement. The realization settled in: these rules weren't about safety or community well-being, they were about power and control. Karen and the board thrived on the anxiety and frustration they generated, and they knew exactly how to push buttons. Then came the most surreal moment. Karen scheduled a mandatory inspection, precisely at the time I had arranged a video call with the state attorney general. I was preparing to present evidence of HOA overreach, a meeting that could expose their absurd and unlawful tactics. She arrived early, as always, clipboard ready, completely unaware that her timing was impeccable or terrible, depending on perspective. Every step she took toward my cabin felt like a countdown to confrontation. My pulse quickened, not out of fear but out of anticipation. Finally, it would all collide. Petty tyranny meeting legal scrutiny. Hours dragged on, filled with tense exchanges. Karen documented every inch of my property, her camera clicking relentlessly, as if she expected me to make a misstep. I tried to keep calm, every action deliberate, careful not to give her the satisfaction of a violation. But the absurdity of her rules, down to the angle of my dock chairs, was maddening. Each check felt like a test of patience, a psychological game where the stakes were humiliation and fines rather than any tangible safety or improvement. Between inspections, I pored over HOA bylaws and correspondence, searching for loopholes, inconsistencies, anything that could protect me. It was exhausting work, rules so vague that every word could be twisted against me. The more I read, the clearer it became that Karen's power relied on fear and confusion. She manipulated the ambiguity of the bylaws, enforcing petty fines while the rest of the community watched silently. This wasn't just harassment, it was a strategic exercise in domination. By late afternoon, Karen had escalated further. She began photographing the inside of my property from the deck, citing visual disturbance complaints. Her notes grew increasingly absurd, as if she were inventing violations on the spot. It became obvious. She was trying to provoke me, to see if I would react and give her more ammunition. But I refused to rise to the bait. Every time she left, I checked my emails, my documentation, and rehearsed my next steps. This wasn't just about a dock anymore. It was about principle, about standing up to someone who believed they could bully neighbors without consequence. The weekend's tension reached a fever pitch when a neighbor, apparently an ally of Karen, approached under the guise of casual conversation. They mentioned seeing irregularities around my property, further feeding into the HOA's narrative. Every interaction felt orchestrated, every glance a reminder that the community I loved had a hidden side, rules enforced not fairly, but weaponized for petty dominance. Each day, my anticipation built. The next inspection, the next fine, the next absurd allegation. How far would they go before it became undeniable harassment? As night fell, I reflected on the mounting absurdity. The fines totaled more than I could reasonably justify, the inspections had become daily, and Karen's obsession with control showed no signs of waning. But a quiet determination began to grow alongside the frustration. I had evidence, documentation, and a looming meeting with the state attorney general that could change everything. The situation teetered on the edge. One more escalation, one more misstep from the HOA, and it could all blow wide open. And just as I began to think I could finally catch my breath, Karen appeared again. Clipboard in hand, eyes scanning every shadow and surface, timing her arrival with almost surgical precision. She didn't know that in mere hours, her overreach would meet the law in a confrontation she never expected. The tension was unbearable, and the stage was set for a showdown that would not only decide the fate of my cabin but expose the absurdity and pettiness of an entire HOA system. The morning sun had barely risen over the lake when Karen appeared again, clipboard in hand, her expression a mixture of triumph and expectation. By now, the pattern was painfully familiar. She would arrive unannounced, document every inch of property, and leave with the satisfaction of someone wielding unchecked authority. But this day was different. Today I was ready, not just to defend my property, but to confront the system that had been harassing me for weeks. As she marched up the gravel driveway, I was already on a video call with the state attorney general, my laptop open on the porch, evidence and documentation at the ready. Every notice, every photo, every petty fine was meticulously organized and time-stamped. I could hear Karen's footsteps approaching, the crunch of gravel echoing like a countdown. My pulse raced, not with fear, but anticipation. The absurdity of her timing would now collide with the law in real time. Karen arrived at the cabin and immediately began her usual inspection, oblivious to the call. She circled the dock, scrutinized the landscaping, and muttered notes under her breath, all while I calmly narrated my compliance and adherence to the bylaws to the Attorney General. At first, she seemed unaware, focused entirely on her checklist, but soon, a flicker of suspicion crossed her face. Something was different. Her power, which had seemed absolute, now felt precarious. I could feel the tension in the air, a charged silence broken only by the faint lapping of the lake against the shore. Then, in a moment I will never forget, I calmly asked the Attorney General to observe Karen's methods as evidence of harassment and abuse of HOA authority. The screen captured her every motion, every obsessive note, every pointed gesture. At first, she froze, then tried to continue, but it was too late. The reality of her overreach was unfolding live before legal eyes. Her face changed, confusion, frustration, and finally, a hint of panic. This was the moment her perceived control slipped. The petty inspections, the fines, the threats, all exposed as what they were, intimidation tactics with no lawful foundation. My heart pounded, not just with relief, but with a quiet, vindicating rage. I had been pushed to the edge, and now, the absurdity of her actions was undeniable. Finally, Karen left, the clipboard still in hand but her aura of authority shattered. The Attorney General leaned in, confirming that the documented harassment and arbitrary fines could lead to significant repercussions for the HOA and board members. The moment of victory was subtle but profound, a combination of legal validation and the personal satisfaction of standing firm against systemic bullying. As the call ended, I looked out over the lake, the water reflecting the morning sun, and thought, sometimes the most absurd petty conflicts reveal the deepest truths about power, fairness, and human behavior. Karen had picked the wrong weekend, the wrong homeowner, and the wrong timing. The battle was far from over, but the tide had clearly shifted. The days after the confrontation were surreal. The lake was calm, the morning mist curling off the water like a quiet sigh, but my mind buzzed with the aftermath of the previous weekend. Karen's relentless inspections, fines, and intimidation had been temporarily halted, but the implications of what had just happened reverberated through the neighborhood and the HOA alike. It was a mix of relief, lingering anxiety, and a cautious sense of triumph. The balance of power had shifted, but the story didn't end at the moment of victory. It had opened a new chapter, one that demanded careful navigation and reflection. Immediately following the Attorney General's review, formal communications arrived. The HOA received notice that many of their fines and violations were legally dubious, unenforceable, and in some cases, bordering on harassment. For the first time, the board members, usually so confident in their control, were forced to confront the possibility that their authority had limits. They could no longer rely solely on fear, gossip, or petty rules to maintain order. Their tactics, which had gone unchecked for years, were now under scrutiny, and the realization unsettled even the most aggressive members. As word spread among neighbors, I noticed a subtle shift in the community dynamic. People who had once whispered complaints or feigned compliance began asking questions, sharing stories of similar experiences, and quietly supporting my efforts. Many admitted they had tolerated the petty tyranny simply because no one had stood up before. My stand had opened the door for dialogue, for collective awareness, and, unexpectedly, a sense of solidarity. It was no longer just my battle. It had become a reflection of the community's growing unwillingness to accept unreasonable power exercised behind the veneer of bylaws. Despite the legal reprieve, life in the cabin required a new rhythm. Every weekend, I continued to meticulously document my property and interactions with the HOA, not out of paranoia, but as a measure of self-protection. This vigilance became a small ritual, a way to reclaim control without being consumed by the absurdity that had characterized Karen's harassment. There were lingering moments of tension whenever the HOA sent a routine email, each line scanned for hidden threats, each word analyzed for potential traps. But these were tempered by the knowledge that the law, the Attorney General, and thorough documentation had become allies I could rely upon. Interestingly, Karen's demeanor shifted after the confrontation. She no longer arrived unannounced, her notes grew less obsessive, and the previously rigid inspection schedules became inconsistent. It was almost as if the realization that she could be watched, recorded, and legally challenged had sapped the audacity that had fueled her previous behavior. There were moments when I caught her across the street, clipboard in hand, pausing mid-step as if questioning the necessity of another intrusion. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The scales had tipped. The legal aftermath introduced additional clarity. The Attorney General's office confirmed that the HOA's actions could constitute harassment if continued in the same manner, and that homeowners in similar positions had grounds to contest arbitrary fines, demand transparency, and, in some cases, pursue restitution. With this validation, I felt a combination of relief and responsibility. My weekend battles were no longer just personal victories. They were precedent-setting experiences that could help others navigate a system often weighted in favor of the board. I began compiling a guide: how to document, how to respond, how to protect oneself, using my story as both a cautionary tale and a roadmap for empowerment. Even with legal victories, emotional recovery required attention. Weeks of heightened tension, constant scrutiny, and the near-obsessive behavior of Karen had left traces of fatigue and irritation. I reminded myself that reclaiming my peace was just as important as defending my property. Gradually, I returned to the routines that had originally drawn me to the lake cabin. Fishing at sunrise, quiet walks along the shoreline, evenings spent watching the water reflect the changing sky. Each ritual became an act of reclaiming normalcy, a reminder that life could continue despite the shadows cast by petty power. The ripple effects extended beyond the cabin. Other neighbors, emboldened by my stand, began questioning unreasonable fines and seeking clarification on vague rules. The HOA board, once a monolith of unquestioned authority, faced increased scrutiny and calls for reform. Committee meetings became more transparent, proposals for rule adjustments were debated publicly, and residents demanded accountability. What had begun as a weekend confrontation evolved into a community-wide awakening. People realized that complacency had allowed petty tyranny to flourish, and that change, while uncomfortable, was possible when courage and persistence intersected. Reflecting on the experience, I realized that the story wasn't solely about Karen or the fines or even the absurd inspections. It was about the nature of power and control, and how ordinary people can assert themselves when faced with arbitrary authority. Karen's obsession with the minutiae of my property, once a source of frustration and anxiety, became a lens through which the community, and I, could see the importance of boundaries, vigilance, and collective accountability. The absurdity of her actions highlighted the fragility of unchecked authority and the power of organized, informed resistance. Emotionally, the confrontation reshaped my understanding of fairness and resilience. I had learned that patience alone was insufficient when faced with systemic abuse, that documentation and legal knowledge were powerful tools, and that standing firm, despite fear or ridicule, was often the most effective strategy. There was satisfaction in the validation, of course, but also a profound sense of responsibility, to use my experience to inform, educate, and empower others who might face similar battles. The lake cabin remained my sanctuary, but it had also become a symbol of what ordinary citizens could achieve when they refused to be bullied. In practical terms, the HOA's overreach has diminished. Fines are issued sparingly, inspections are less aggressive, and transparency is now enforced in board communications. While vigilance remains necessary, the environment has improved, creating a healthier, more respectful community dynamic. Residents now participate in conversations about rules, and accountability is no longer a distant concept. It is tangible, visible, and enforceable. The contrast between the chaos of the weekend confrontation and the measured, more rational HOA interactions today is striking. Ultimately, the experience underscored a broader lesson. Systems of power, whether local boards, organizations, or institutions, thrive when left unchecked, but they are never invulnerable. Even the most obsessive enforcers, the Karen figures who relish authority, can be countered with preparation, persistence, and courage. It also revealed the importance of community solidarity. One person standing up can inspire others to question, challenge, and reclaim fairness. There is a balance between respecting rules and resisting tyranny, and understanding that balance is what turns frustration into empowerment. Looking back on that chaotic weekend, I often wonder, how many others endure similar petty tyranny in silence, unaware that pushback is possible? How many cabins, homes, or neighborhoods are silently governed by fear of arbitrary rules, unchecked inspections, or fines that feel more personal than procedural? It is a sobering thought, but also a call to action. By standing firm, documenting carefully, and leveraging available legal avenues, ordinary people can shift the balance, restore fairness, and reclaim the peace that makes a home more than just a property. As the sun dips behind the trees, painting the lake in shades of orange and purple, I feel a quiet satisfaction. Karen's obsession no longer dictates my weekends, and the cabin feels like the sanctuary it always was meant to be. Yet, the experience leaves a lasting impression. Power, when wielded irresponsibly, can disrupt lives in the most absurd ways, but it is also remarkably vulnerable to courage, preparation, and principled resistance. In the end, standing up doesn't just protect property. It protects dignity, sanity, and the very essence of community. And so, as I watch the water ripple gently across the lake, I can't help but ask myself, and perhaps anyone who might listen, what would happen if more people refused to let petty authority dictate their lives? How many small victories, quietly won, could reshape entire neighborhoods? In that question lies the true impact of a weekend that began with coffee and chaos, and ended with justice, reflection, and the slow, steady reclaiming of peace.